This is the third generation Aquasource Henshaw Toilet. However, most people would know this more as the Project Source Proflush when it was introduced in 2020. In 2019, Aquasource decided to redesign their Henshaw into its third generation. However, this particular model would not last. Around 2020, a weird conversion would happen to where Aquasource would become Project Source, and they would start selling their Proflush models. The elongated version, which is based on this, but with some slight redesigns like the tank and the trapway opening, and they would also introduce a round ball version as well, which is based on the Colby. In today's review, we're mostly focusing on the elongated Proflush and the third generation Aquasource Henshaw. So why am I kind of reviewing both of them in the same review? And that's because they're pretty much the same thing. This obviously has the second generation designs, which is the only thing different from the Proflush. The Proflush was slightly redesigned with a different tank and a slightly different trapway opening. But besides that, they're pretty much the same toilet. So let's talk about it. And let's see if it's worth buying one of these. For starters, the overall design, well, you can tell it's a cheap toilet. And I don't really care for the design on this, but honestly, I don't even care for the design even more on the Proflush. On the Proflush, it has this weird tank, and the lid itself sticks out like an eyesore, and I just don't like it. Safe to say, I like this version, the Aquasource version, a lot better than the Proflush version. The trapway opening is very similar to that of the second generation on the Aquasource version. However, it would get slightly refined on the Project Source Proflush version. While I can't really get a good view of the rim jets, they are slightly angled. And towards the front are some powerful rim jets, which gives it more of a front flush, which is quite interesting. Now, I don't know how much different it is in the Project Source version, but here's what's different about it in the Henshaw version. As you can tell, they started slowly moving away from the cheap Chinese parts, which most Aquasource toilets had back in the 2010s. Here you got a fluid master fill valve, which is nice, but you unfortunately do have a cheap flapper. Thankfully, you can easily replace this, and it's an easy fix. You just need a simple 2-inch flapper, and you're good to go. Interestingly, on this one, the water level is a little over, which is, I guess, due to the setup, but tank parts themselves are definitely an improvement compared to the first and second generations of the Henshaw. I don't know how much different it is on the Proflush, but I'm pretty sure it's just about the same as this. Now let's take a look at a flush. Let's do a press and release first, since this is a 1.28. The flush is quite interesting. However, since this is 1.28, the flush is a little short. Now let's get a more full flush with the handle held down. While the flush has not improved that much, it's just extended, it definitely helps out with the pull and siphon. Now there are some interesting positives with this version of Henshaw and the Proflush, and that is the pulling factor. Since there is a front jet, it does help out a lot with pulling things down a lot better. Even on the weaker 1.28 flush, the pulling factor is definitely better than a lot of toilets that also use 1.28. While it's still not perfect on 1.28, it definitely helps out a little bit more. Although definitely using a little bit more water definitely helps make the pull a lot more efficient. One thing that this thing has going for it is performance. It's definitely a lot better, especially for a cheaper toilet like this. I couldn't really say the same about the second generation Henshaw, which is what this generation is based on, but this version definitely performs a lot better. Now again, it does have its problems on 1.28 usage, but it's still a lot better than the Henshaw of the second generation. The same can be said for the Proflush. While it's not great on 1.28, it's definitely a lot better on higher water levels. Now let's get to some drawbacks. The quality control is still not good. And it's the same with the Proflush as well. One thing I've noticed is just how inconsistent the front jets are. As you can see, on this one it had more of a swirlier flush, although sometimes other versions of the third gen Henshaw and the Proflush have a more straight down flush. And also, it is slightly inconsistent with the trapway opening. This one's obviously a more earlier version, and the Proflush is a little bit more refined, but still, they tend to look different from one another, which does not help. And while we're on quality control, since this is a cheap toilet, I don't really see the quality of the porcelain holding up well. While I haven't seen any reports about it, there's been a lot of reports of many modern toilets, especially more main brand companies like Kohler and American Standard, having very poor quality control with its porcelain, so I would not be surprised if this also has the same issue, especially considering that this is a budget toilet. Now let's get to the one thing I absolutely hate about this toilet. The ball rinse is absolute crap. Let's have a look at it. Now while it looks good over here, the back corner, and especially this spot right here, tends to gather up a lot of stuff. I've even seen toilet paper get stuck to the back rim here, which is absolutely ridiculous. You would think for having angled rim jets that would fix the problem, but that's just one thing about this quality control, it's just not good. And that is the third generation Aquasource Henshaw Toilet and the Project Source Proflush Toilets. This is a very interesting design, and even though this was kind of late into Aquasource's life, I'm glad that they did improve upon a pretty terrible design. There are still some drawbacks, like the quality control and the bowl rinse, and especially problems that continue on with the Proflush that are pretty much the same as this, especially with consistency, but it is definitely one of the more better budget toilets out there. I can't really say the same about the round bowl, but that's a different story for another day. But let's grade the elongated Henshaw and the Proflush. Let's begin. Let's begin with the overall designs of both of these toilets. I don't like them. Granted, that's to be expected considering they are cheap toilets and they look cheap and generic. If I have to choose though, I definitely think the Henshaw looks better compared to the Proflush version. The Proflush version just sticks out like a sore thumb with its tank. I don't like it. But in all honesty, I'm going to rank them both the same and give them both a 4 in design. You know what? It's finally nice to see Aquasource move away from cheap, crappy parts, except the flapper. It's just a typical water-saving flapper, and I hate it. But hey, it has a fluid master fill valve, so I'll give it credit there. The fill valve is nice, but the flapper definitely drags it back a little bit, and the Proflush really isn't much different, as far as I can tell. So the parts overall get a 4 because of that. Would you be shocked that the quality control is not good? No? Me neither. Well, this is to be expected for a cheap budget toilet, but the problems are definitely noticeable. Stuff with the ball rinse, some with the inconsistent designs, especially with the later Proflush design, and so much more. There's even some problems with the porcelain quality itself, which is not a good sign, and as you'll see, it affects something much later and down the list. Overall, it's getting a 4. The trapway? It's generic, but it works. I give it a 5. Okay, the flush is definitely one of the better flushes on this toilet, but for the lower end score, it's only getting a 4 because it cuts off way too short, as expected. But for the longer flush, it actually has a fairly nice flush for a modern toilet. Notice how I said modern toilet. You know, outside of the whole vortex toilets, and especially some older toilets that definitely flush a lot better than this, for a modern toilet, it doesn't flush too bad. It's kind of like a front flusher in a way, but with a siphon jet almost. Sometimes it swirls due to the defective rim jets and stuff, or how it's designed. I don't know. It's a cheap toilet. But for the higher end scale, I'd definitely give it a 7. The pulling factor and siphon are a 4 on the lower end score, which is definitely better than some other 1.28 toilets of the time, but on the higher end it's definitely a lot better. It pulls down pretty well, and especially with the front jets, it definitely helps things get down a lot better. I give it a 7. Performance really isn't the greatest on the lower end scale and gets a 4. But on the higher end scale, if you actually use all the water in the tank or up to 1.6 gallons or so, this thing performs quite well for a budget toilet. I'm honestly quite impressed. But some qualities do kind of draw it back a little bit due to how cheap this toilet is. So overall, I'll give it a 7. Here's the problem though, the ball rinse kinda sucks. On the lower end score, it's definitely getting a 2. But on the higher end scale, it's getting a 3. I definitely think this has to do something with the porcelain quality, because honestly the ball rinse doesn't look that bad. It actually looks kind of competent. But I guess due to the cheaper porcelain quality, it definitely drags it down and stuff can get stuck, whether it be stains and even toilet paper, which is honestly quite ridiculous. Survivability can go either way. On the lower end scale, at most, it's a 4. On the higher end scale, it definitely has a higher chance of surviving due to some of its more higher qualities, but there are some low qualities that would drag it down a little bit, like the porcelain quality and just the overall quality control. Therefore, kind of making it a 6 at most. Now let's talk about the overall value. If you're relying on a press and release flush, this toilet, and like most modern toilets in general, is not for you. It's cheap, it's not very effective, the flush kind of cuts off short, the performance isn't good, and all that stuff, and I give it a 3. But how about the high-end scale? I honestly don't know. This is the most mixed I've ever felt about a toilet. Sure, there's some good qualities about it, like the flush, the pulling factor, and even the performance being improved compared to the second generation of the Henshaw, but you also have some poor qualities dragging it down. The cheap porcelain quality, the quality control being inconsistent, especially with the Proflush versions, and the ball rinse still kind of sucking even on full of power. I don't know, man. I mean, for a budget toilet, yeah, I definitely think it would be worth it, but compared to some other options, I still find value in those than this. I mean, for a budget toilet, it definitely does its job, but it does have some drawbacks. Would I recommend this toilet? I don't know. Overall, I think the Mansfield Summit is definitely better in terms of doing its job better, even though it has some of the worst tank parts ever made. But thankfully those could be fixed. But with this one though, just so much of the poor quality of this toilet just kind of drags it down a little bit. I really don't know how to feel about this toilet. This is the most I felt about a toilet in a while. And honestly, because of that, I'm giving it a 5. It's somewhere in the middle, honestly. Here are the final scores of both the third generation Aquasource Henshaw and the Project Source Proflush Elongated toilets. The low end score is a 38 out of 100, while the higher end score is a 52 out of 100. This toilet is definitely a definition of a mixed bag. On lower end scales, it's definitely well worth, but when you actually invest your time to this, there might be some value getting out of this, but there are still some qualities that drag it down due to how cheap it is. It is a budget toilet after all. Again, I don't know if I highly recommend this toilet, but for a budget toilet, if you're looking to get cheap, I guess this is your best bet. But still, watch out for its drawbacks.